My name is Cal Whitmore. I am 35. I assess the structural integrity of buildings, residential and commercial, which means I am paid to look at things other people have stopped looking at and identify what is quietly wrong. Subsidence, damp penetration, load-bearing walls that have been asked to carry more than they were designed for. I produce reports that are detailed and rarely read in full by anyone who has commissioned them, which suits me. I am not a person who requires an audience. I live on Doveridge Street, which is a road of semi-detached houses built in the early 1960s and maintained with varying degrees of conviction. Mine is the one with the good guttering and the slightly overgrown front hedge that I have been meaning to address since October. Number 11, across the road and 3 houses along, is Mara Lindqvist's. She had moved in 14 months before the morning in question. She had arrived on a Saturday in November with a removal van. A woman I later understood was her sister, and an organizational approach to unpacking that was evident even from across the road. Labeled boxes. A system for the furniture. The kind of moving in that reads as a person who has done this before and has decided to do it without letting it be chaotic. I had thought competent. I had thought private. I had thought good guttering on that one too, actually, which is the kind of thought that tells you less about guttering than it does about avoidance. I had introduced myself 3 days later over the recycling bins on a Tuesday morning. She had short, dark hair and a mouth that looked like it was considering a verdict on most things. She had shaken my hand and said her name and mentioned that she was a community pharmacist, which explained the precision. She had gray eyes that stayed on things a beat longer than was strictly necessary, and she had a quality I clocked within 4 minutes of meeting her. She listened in a way that made you aware of what you were actually saying, rather than what you had planned to say. I had returned the recycling bin to my drive and gone inside and made coffee and told myself none of that was relevant information. I had been a reasonable neighbor since then. Not intrusive. Present when presence was useful. I had mentioned in month 3 that I was competent with cars. I did my own servicing as a matter of practicality, and she had said she would bear that in mind, in the tone of someone filing information correctly. She bore it in mind 14 months later, which is when everything shifted. But I need to tell you about the 11 months before the car. Mara Lindqvist had moved to Doveridge Street in the wake of something. I did not know what, specifically, for a long time. You develop a sense, in structural assessment work, for the difference between a building that is simply old and a building that has been through something, some event or pressure or failure that has left the structure changed in ways the surface does not immediately show. Mara had that quality in those first months. She was present and capable and entirely composed, and there was something beneath the composure that had the feeling of weight. She kept the house well. She worked long shifts and came home in the particular way of people whose work cost them something, and she walked the street in the evenings sometimes, not far and not for long, as if the air was the thing she needed, rather than the distance. She had a car she drove to the pharmacy, and a playlist on her phone she played through the speaker on her kitchen windowsill on Saturday mornings, which I could hear if my kitchen window was open, which it often was because I run warm. The playlist was called, I discovered by accident one Saturday, when I had come over to return a parcel that had been delivered to my address in error. Things that are still true. I saw it on her phone screen as she reached to turn it down. I did not mention it. The name stayed with me in the way of things that are none of your business and still answer a question you hadn't thought to ask. She had good neighbors on both sides, an older couple to the left who brought her things from the allotment, a family to the right with children who treated the pavement as a communal asset. She had her sister visiting once a month. She had a life that was functional and self-sufficient, and she was clearly managing it, and I had no intention of becoming a person who decided that managing something was the same as being fine. In month 7, I did something that was not my instinct and not my habit. I knocked on her door on a Saturday afternoon, with a reason that was partly genuine and partly not, which was that I had made too much of a particular stew, and my single-person household could not manage the surplus. She had looked at the container, and then at me, with the expression she uses when she is assessing whether a thing is what it appears to be. Then she had stood aside and said, "Come in, then." We had eaten at her kitchen table. She had told me about the pharmacy, and I had told her about load-bearing walls, and at some point the conversation had moved past the professional and into the personal, and she had said, with a directness I was starting to recognize as simply how she spoke, "I came here after my marriage ended, 8 months ago. I needed a street I didn't know yet." She had said it without asking for anything in return, as a piece of information filed correctly. I had said, "How is it going?" The not knowing yet. She had said, "Better than it was, slower than I'd like." I had said, "I know a bit about structures that are repairing. It tends to be slower than the person inside would prefer." She had looked at me with the quality she has of giving full attention to a thing. Then she had said, "That's a surprisingly useful way to put it." We had washed up together, and I had gone home and sat in my kitchen and thought. Careful. I had been careful since then. Usefully present, not intrusively so. There when she mentioned something she needed, a hand with the recycling on the high collection weeks, a second opinion on a letter from a letting agent about the guttering dispute, a person to acknowledge on the street in the way that confirms the street is not indifferent to you. I had not made anything of the Saturday afternoon. I had not mentioned it again. I had behaved, with considerable personal effort, like a decent neighbor in possession of no particular feelings. I was, at this point in the story, in possession of quite particular feelings, which I was managing through the application of professional discipline and the maintenance of appropriate distance. This is not a sustainable strategy. I had known this for approximately 4 months before the car. January arrived with the specific intention of making everything harder. The weather was the kind that sits in the bones, and the street had the gray, compressed quality of a place that has forgotten it was ever not this color. Mara had worked 6 days the week prior. I knew this because I had seen the car leave early and return late, and because I had run into her sister outside on the Saturday, who had mentioned it in the way of someone who was keeping an eye and was not entirely happy with what she was seeing. On the Monday morning, I was leaving early for a site visit when I noticed the car was still on the drive. This was unusual. I checked the time. It was later than she typically left. I did not knock on the door, because she was a capable adult with a reasonable grip on her own schedule, and noticing that a neighbor's car was on their drive at 8:15 a.m. was not a structural emergency. I went to work. I came back at 12:30. The car was still there. I assessed this. I considered and discarded several explanations. Then I thought, she mentioned, in month 3, that she had been having trouble starting it in cold weather. I thought, the temperature this morning was -3. I knocked on the door with the specific purpose of offering to look at the car, which was legitimate and non-intrusive. And if the car was fine, I would say I was returning a delivery and leave. She answered in her pharmacy uniform, coat half on, keys in hand, with the expression of a person who had been trying to solve a problem by herself for long enough that the problem had started winning. She said, "It won't start. I've been trying since 7. I've called the pharmacy, they've got cover, but I need to," I said. "Let me look at it." She said, "I don't want to." I said, It'll take 5 minutes. It took 112 seconds. The battery terminals had corroded. A slow process, almost invisible. The kind of failure that accumulates quietly over time until one cold morning it becomes a complete one. I cleaned them with what I had, reconnected them properly, checked the connectors were seated. I closed the bonnet. I told her to try the ignition. The engine started. She sat in the driver's seat. She had one hand on the wheel. The heater came on and the radio came on, and her phone, connected to the car's speaker, resumed the playlist she had apparently been listening to when she last drove it. And the song that came through was something slow and quiet that I did not recognize, and the playlist name was visible on the screen from where I was standing. Things that are still true. She sat very still. I watched her not move. I had my cloth in my hand and the cold was considerable, and the car engine was running, and everything was technically resolved. And then she started crying. Not loudly. Not performance. The kind of crying that happens when a thing you have been holding at a careful distance suddenly has nowhere left to go, and the thing that triggers it is not the real thing at all, but simply the last small weight in a long accumulation of them. Her hands went to her face. Her shoulders moved once. She made no sound for a moment, and then a sound that was very small and entirely unguarded. I stood on the drive. I am a person who responds to structural failure by assessing first, then acting. I assess load. I assess capacity. I assess what the structure has been asked to carry and whether it was designed for that weight. I do not fix things without understanding them. I understood this. I opened the passenger door and got in. She did not look at me. She had her hands over her face, and she was crying in the way of someone who had been managing something for a long time and had simply run out of the energy the management required. The car was warming up. The playlist played quietly. I did not say anything. After a while, she said, from behind her hands, "I'm sorry." I said, "Don't." She said, "It's not the car." I said, "I know." She lowered her hands. She looked at the windscreen, which was beginning to clear from the cold. She had the quality now of someone who has been seen doing something they did not intend to be seen doing and is deciding what to do about it. Then she seemed to decide not to do anything about it, which is, in my experience, the braver choice. She said, "I have been fine. I have been so fine. For months." She said it like it was a report she had been filing and had just discovered was based on incorrect data. "And it's been hard, and I've been fine, and I manage, and then you clean 2 terminals, and the car starts, and I can't." She stopped. She pressed the heel of her hand against her eye. "I can't explain why that broke it." I said, "You don't have to explain it." She said, "I've been doing everything myself for 8 months. Everything, and I'm good at it." I am. But sometimes something just works. Something just gets fixed. And it turns out that's the thing that... She stopped. I said, after a moment, when a structure has been carrying a load for a long time, there's a point where the right change doesn't feel like relief. It feels like whatever was holding everything together has finally been given permission to let go. I paused. That's not a failure. That's the structure responding correctly. She turned and looked at me. Her eyes were still wet, and her expression had the quality of someone who has just heard the accurate thing said in the right order. She said, "You always do that." I said, "Do what?" She said, "Say the thing that's actually true, in the plainest possible way, without making it about you." A pause. I notice things. I notice things about you, and I have been very careful about what I do with that. Because I moved here to not complicate anything, and you are across the road, and you are." She stopped again. She looked at the windscreen. "You brought Stu in July. You said it was too much for one person. It was not too much for one person, was it?" It was not a question. I said no. She said right. She considered this. "How long?" I said, "Since month 2. "Approximately," she said, "month 2. She absorbed this. "I've been here 14 months. I said, "Yes." She said, "And you waited." I said, "You needed the street first. That's what you said. You needed time on it." I looked at the dashboard. I have a reasonable amount of patience when the situation calls for it. She looked at me for a long time. The song on the playlist changed. The car was warm now, which was a thing that had not been true this morning and was true now, and I was aware of this in the way you become aware of small changes when everything else has gone still. She said, "I'm not sure I'm entirely fixed yet." I said, "I know. I'm not asking for fixed." She said, "What are you asking for?" I said, "Permission to be across the road." More officially, I paused. "And maybe eventually less across the road." Something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, she does not do dramatic, but entirely in the way of a thing that has been held carefully for a long time and is considering setting itself down. She said, "I kept thinking you were just, kind, that it was just how you were with everyone." I said, "I'm a reasonably decent neighbor in general. This is something else." She said, "I know." I knew. She looked at her hands, which were in her lap and no longer shaking. "That's why I was being careful." I said, "We've both been careful." She said, "Yes." A pause. "I think I'm done with careful." She turned her hand over on the center console. "An open offer." A closed question. I put my hand over hers. She looked at me, and her eyes were still wet, and her expression was the most unguarded I had ever seen it, and she looked exactly like what she was. A person who had been carrying a great deal for a long time and had decided, in a warming car on a January morning, that she did not have to carry all of it alone anymore. I did not say anything else. Sometimes the thing that is true does not need to be said twice. By March, the hedge was done. This was Mara's contribution. She had mentioned, precisely once, that it was beginning to encroach on the pavement. And the way she mentioned it made clear she had a view on the matter and was extending me the professional courtesy of acting on it myself. I acted on it. She brought out coffee when I was halfway through, which she had started doing in the particular way of a person who has decided that a habit is now a fact. She was still at number 11. I was still at number 8. These were the technical facts of the arrangement, and we had not yet revised them, and neither of us was in any particular hurry, because she had come here needing time and I was a person with patience, and some things are correctly done at the speed they require. She still played the playlist on Saturday mornings. I could hear it from my kitchen when the window was open, which it increasingly was. I had asked her once, carefully, what the name meant to her. Things that are still true. She had thought about it in the way she thinks about things, properly and without rushing. She had said, "I made it after everything fell apart. I needed to know what was still there. What hadn't changed." She had paused. It kept getting longer, actually. Every few months I'd think of something else to add. I had asked her what the most recent addition was. She had looked at me with the gray eyes and the considering expression. She had said, "You." Obviously, I had looked at the kitchen window. I had thought about 112 seconds and corroded terminals and the specific quality of January cold and a woman crying quietly in a warming car because something small had finally worked. Some things that appear to be about the car are not about the car. Some things that appear to be about being fixed are about something considerably larger than being fixed. I was aware of both of these before that morning. I am more certain of them now. Years later, when people ask how it started, she tells it first. She says, "He cleaned 2 battery terminals in the cold, and the car started, and I cried for 10 minutes in the front seat." She tells it like it is a fact she has made peace with, which it is. She laughs when she tells it, the real one, the one that catches slightly before it settles, and then she says, "He got in the passenger seat without being asked and didn't say anything for a while. And that was it for me." I tell her she has simplified the timeline. She tells me the timeline is not the point. She is, as usual, correct. What would you have done if the thing that finally broke someone open turned out to be the smallest thing, after all the hard things hadn't? And have you ever kept your distance from someone because you thought that was what they needed, when the truth was something else? Tell me in the comments. If this one stayed with you, a like and a subscribe means I'll keep making them, and I'll see you in the next one.